Dear brothers, morning fellas. For those of you who have not read The Splendid and the Vile by Eric Larson, I could not recommend it anymore. Really, any of the books that he's written. But The Splendid and the Vile is by far my favorite. It is a compilation of journal entries and recordings from Churchill's first year at the helm as prime minister, including those journal entries from his daughter and from his people that worked with him and himself and a host of people during that time. It is an absolute work of art, and there is a lot to pull from it, and it just tells you a lot about the volatility of that time and how the tides could have easily changed at any given time into Nazi Germany's hand. But again, I can't recommend it enough. I've become such a big Churchill fan because of this book, amongst other things. But I want to pull a specific part out of it today that really brings clarity to the idea of bearing the burden of your responsibility. So it's Good Friday, and Churchill was touring the city of Swansea, hopefully I'm saying that right, in Wales. And the next day he was going to be off to Bristol to see basically the destruction that the Germans had wrought on them to that point. And as his daughter Mary writes, the devastation in parts of the town is ghastly. And so as Churchill's making his way through the crowds, throughout this part of the book, it just talks about how he would constantly go to these cities and he's walking amongst the people and looking at the devastation, and it was important to him that they saw him. And in this part, Mary writes down about the townspeople that are looking at him as he's walking around. And she says, "Never have I seen such courage, love, cheerfulness, and confidence expressed as by the people today. Where he went, they swarmed around Papa, clasping his hand, patting him on the back, shouting his name." That evening, what was deemed the Good Friday raid occurred. Lasted about 6 hours, where it's reported that like 200 tons of high explosives and 37,000 incendiaries were dropped by the Germans. It killed 180 civilians, wounded 382 more. And it was after this evening of bombings in Bristol that Churchill arrived to see the damage the next day. And so he's walking through the streets, seeing men, women, children, and everybody kind of looking at him. And he was actually making his way to Bristol University for a degree ceremony. And I still find this to be one of the craziest stories that somewhat defines the people that time in England. Life just went on amidst all of this crazy chaos. The book goes on about parties still taking place. Meanwhile, there's like bombings occurring overhead. I just think to myself, like, if my city was bombed and 200 folks died, I wouldn't be thinking about getting a degree the next day. There's so many stories like that throughout this book, and it still boggles me. But Churchill's daughter Mary says this as they're getting into Bristol at the university. "People kept on arriving late, with grime on their faces, half washed off, their ceremonial robes on over their firefighting clothes, which were still wet. All of these people who just had a bunch of bombs drop on them overnight show up to see him speak with their robes on, but still covered in soot from trying to clean up what happened the night before. The people of England just kept moving forward." And so Churchill's at this ceremony, and he gives one of my favorite speeches to the people there. And he says the following: "Many of those here today have been all night at their posts, and all have been under the fire of the enemy in heavy and protracted bombardment. That you should gather in this way is a mark of fortitude and phlegm, of a courage and detachment from material affairs worthy of all that we have learned to believe of ancient Rome or of modern Greece. I see the damage done by the enemy attacks, but I also see, side by side with the devastation and amid the ruins, quiet, confident, bright, and smiling eyes, beaming with a consciousness of being associated with a cause far higher than any human or personal issue. I see the spirit of an unconquerable people." End quote. Whenever I read that line, "I see the spirit of an unconquerable people," I get a very serious set of the chills. Just imagine Churchill's booming voice in front of all these people who were just bombed, many of whom died. You can't help but feel this ethereal feeling throughout the crowd, something outside of this world, something divine, something that men simply weren't capable of doing, which is bringing hope to people. Not just hope, but a vigor for winning, a vitality, a confidence that they were going to win this affair and that they have a divine mission to succeed. How could someone be so strong? How could they look the part of someone who could lead them to victory, coming up with these speeches, which he did all the time? And this is where I believe one of the most beautiful moments ever captured from the war takes place. And I'm so grateful to Erik Larson for capturing it in this book. So Churchill has left the university and he's in the train and they're leaving the town. And the people are, waving and chanting, and he's waving back to them, and he continues to wave until the train, makes its way out of sight. And as they're going away, he sits down and grabs a newspaper, which he uses to hide the tears coming down his face. And then he says this: "They have such confidence. It is a grave responsibility." I get the fucking chills every time I think of that scene. Churchill sitting in a train with tears streaming down his face, the emotion, the culmination of knowing that so many people are looking to him to get them out of this, to save them from this, to be the person that helps them win this. And you have to think to yourself, he's just a man. But he's a man that's been given a responsibility to lead a people against a tyrant, an abominable tyrant at that, a tyrant that's willing to literally lose everything to succeed and willing to kill and destroy anything in its path. Churchill's the one they're looking to for guidance, the one they're looking to for hope, the one that people are praying to God to every day that they can somehow get out of this darkness. Far earlier in the book, when Churchill's getting elected as prime minister, he has a couple of paragraphs where he basically says he was put on this earth for such a time, for such a role. This was his purpose in life. And that's to lead his people. And in the midst of odds that were awful, not good. And I think really the thing that's so apt to me is that all of this specific example occurs on Easter weekend. And I have absolutely no proof to my following claim, but it comes to mind, and I think it's quite possible and something that I think resonates or will resonate with all of you. And I imagine to myself that as Churchill laid down in bed on that Easter weekend, being a man of history and certainly a man of faith, that he must have considered to himself the responsibility that Christ bore on the cross and ultimately the victory that came out of that for humanity. And in thinking on that, realizing that his job was to bear his responsibility as the man he was called to be, just like Christ bore his. And that thought also gives me far more chills. And I think that all of us should consider this as we look at our own responsibilities. We may not all be attempting to defeat Nazi Germany and feed our people and manage foreign affairs and be all the aspects that a leader in wartime has to be. But we are responsible for taking care of our children, for taking care of our wife, for working hard at our craft, for bearing the responsibility of suffering in and of itself. Whatever responsibility belongs to us, though, it is ours to bear, just like Christ bore his, just like Winston Churchill bore his. And I think that the most beautiful aspect of this that we have to understand is that other people rely on us. And to be responsible to them is a gift. It is a grave responsibility, as Churchill talked about, but it's one that we're capable of performing if we will but just stay hopeful, faithful, diligent, and utterly unshakable. Fellas, our victory is won in Christ on the cross and in the resurrection for that matter. That means that our job on this earth is to be responsible to those we love and to our purpose in life. In doing so, we honor the gifts that God's given us and we expand his kingdom. I don't mean to be preachy to any of you today, but I think it's vital that I point out that we are given responsibilities in this world, and to meet them, we must endure suffering, be patient, and work till our hands bleed. Then we have to do it again. In Christ, God has given us victory over death, which is the most powerful thing in the world. And I hope that all of you really come to grips with that. But in knowing that, we can create our own victory over mediocrity here on earth by facing our suffering and responsibilities boldly, knowing that such suffering is not in vain. It is for the goodness of the world and the ones that we love. That is a burden as men we should all be willing to bear. And I hope that, this example of Churchill, and again, all of you, go buy The Splendid and the Vile. I'll put a link to it in the description. You will pull so much wisdom and strength and ideas on leadership out of it that I really think that you'll come out a better man just from looking at what someone did in the face of severe adversity. As always, I love you all. God bless. Be strong. Let's get after it today, boys. See y'all.